Hey there, I'm Dave Otero here with URM Academy, and we are going to take a look at the Neural DSP plugin Darkglass Ultra. Contains two different models, both useful, and we're going to kind of explore setting up the tones, how to compare between the two different models, and figure out what is the right tone and model for this mix, and maybe help you decide how you might make those decisions in your own projects. Before we get into the plugin, I'm going to show you the project. We have essentially a completed mix here, but a completely raw bass DI. So let's listen to the mix with just the raw bass DI, see what we're starting with. So the mix is already sounding pretty good. Bass obviously is a little raw feeling and not really doing what it needs to do. It needs some juice, it needs some amp, it needs some grit, it needs some vibe. Let's load it up. Here we have a completely stock instance. Let's go ahead and start on the B7K model. You can see there's two separate models. So it's like essentially two hardware pedals that they've modeled. But the cool thing about these is they have the exact same controls. Even the EQ crossover points are the same. We can start by dialing in one and then see how well that translates to the other model, compare them both in this mix, and get to know the pros and cons and the different sounds and shapes of either. First thing I'm going to do is make sure that oversampling is set to high. All these plugins, if you're using this in a mix scenario, you're going to want to go to highest oversampling. If you're tracking and you need to take latency in consideration or CPU usage in consideration, by all means, lower that. But for a mix purpose, you're going to want to just shift to high end right away. The first thing I'm going to do is just get some preliminary gain staging and set up a drive just in sort of a spot so we can hear the pedal before we really get into the details. So let's solo the bass. And I'm going to start making some changes here, and I'll talk you through them after the fact. So both of these pedals essentially have two different circuits. There's like the preamp circuit, which is just the overall shifting, and you can hear that if you just disable the distortion side. And then there's the additional distortion gain, which you can blend in using the blend knob. So with the blend knob all the way down, you still get some of the preamp. And then if you enable the distortion and crank the blend up, you can blend in to taste that distorted signal. So let's just hear what just the preamp is doing with the blend all the way down. Pretty subtle. It's mostly this EQ section, and you're getting a little bit of like that amp saturation. So we're going to want to blend in a little distortion first, kind of get a general mix vibe, and then we're going to kind of tweak some EQs. And I know we still have the other model to go through, but I find it a little easier to kind of start with one, get something that's starting to sound pretty good before we decide which model we're going to go with. So let's bring the blend up, then I'm going to work my way through the EQ section. Cool. Okay, so we have two filter options, attack and grunt here. It's essentially like a high shelf and a low shelf. So we can tweak those first. Kind of like the more aggressive high bump with this middle selection and the grunt. And I'm feeling like the flat selection is a little more balanced here. So then we have 4 EQ bands. The bass and treble are both fixed frequencies, and then we have adjustable frequencies for the low mids and high mids. So I'm going to tweak those left to right, explore a bit with those different frequency points, and just kind of, at this point, dial in something that sounds pretty balanced to my ears. Again, just listening in solo for now. So you notice the first thing I did with this low mid was add a pretty good amount of boost and then cycle through my frequency options. That kind of trains my brain of where I'm supposed to be listening for. It helps me identify those frequency points and kind of their shape, their Q levels a little more. And then I know I'm going to want to cut them. And I ended up deciding to leave this on the 250 hertz with just a little bit of cut right here. And then we'll move on to high mids. Cool. That sounds pretty good to me. Before we check out the other model, we're going to want to quickly peek at our cab section. I happen to know that I like the way this plugin sounds on its default as far as the cab selection goes. The 52A sounds about right to my ears as far as a mic model. I will sometimes move the position closer to the center, but it's not a huge change on this plugin. We can kind of see what that sounds like. The mids get a little aggressive right when it's on the center of that cone. So somewhere out here sounds good. I'll occasionally blend in some of the sub kick. It's kind of a useful sound too. Let's see what that sounds like. We're going to bring the mic level down a bit here. Yeah, that's kind of cool. Helps round it out a bit, just mixed in quite a bit lower than the 52A. So let's hear this in context and dial in a level with the mix. Cool. Made a few tweaks. I was hearing some mid-range kind of honking at me, so moved that mic a bit further out towards the edge and just brought down the high mids and seemed to take care of it. So let's go back into solo mode and see how the vintage model sounds. And the cool thing about this plugin is with EQ link on, you can just switch over and it just kind of moves all your settings. Again, they're different pedals, so it doesn't completely translate. So we'll hear that when I play it here. They're not perfect replicas. I guess what would be the point of having a different model if they were? But let's compare a bit in the mix between the two models. And then maybe if we feel like it's necessary, we'll go ahead and duplicate the track, have one of each model and kind of dial them in a little bit separately and see which fits the mix better and talk about the differences between them. So let's go back to the B7K. We're going to stay soloed and then I'll play a little bit of this and then switch. So you can hear most of the difference is in the distortion circuits. In fact, when I turn the distortion off and switch back and forth, they sound pretty much identical, maybe actually exactly identical, but if there are any differences, they're very subtle. So we can mostly focus on how that drive is sounding different. But obviously with the different sounding distortion, you're going to maybe want different EQ settings as well. So now that we've heard the difference between the two models, and since I've pretty much dialed the B7K in to sound pretty good in the mix, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate these tracks. That way we can give the vintage the same treatment, dial it in specifically, kind of make some altercations with the mix in mind, and then we can compare them directly once they're both dialed in. So let's go ahead and duplicate our bass DI. I'll call one B7K and one vintage. Vintage. That's how you spell vintage. Got it. Nailed it. So I'm just going to disable the B7K for now. And let's solo the vintage and kind of dial that in a bit in solo and then go back and forth a bit once we have these in place. So you can pretty quickly hear the tonal differences, a lot more mid-forward, a lot more vintage sounding, I suppose. I'm not trying to completely make them sound the same, but I'm trying to give them a little bit of balance. And I felt like the mids were just pushing too much for this tone with the vintage. So I'm going to dial those back a touch. I think they'll still sound different. We're not trying to like get them in exactly the same spot. But balanced out, bring it in the mix, kind of do a little bit of that more same treatment, and then kind of compare both on individual faders. Okay, now with the mix. Cool. Let's bring in our original track. I'm going to keep these on two different faders so we can kind of play with one at a time and potentially even blend them. I don't know that I've ever tried that, but we can right here. So let's start back with the Ultra. They actually sound pretty cool blended. I'm learning this right now at the same time all of you are. Separately, I prefer, in this instance, the B7K. I tend to gravitate towards that one. It's just more my style. It's a little more modern, a little more scooped. It fits better in this mix, in my opinion. But I can also see use cases where the vintage, that like rattier, more mid-forward sound of the vintage could be really cool. And truthfully, where I end up using this plugin often is as an augment to other bass tones. So knowing the different tonal characteristics of both models, if you have a tone that you're starting with already and you're looking to add a little bit of bite to it, that's what I feel like this plugin is really good at, adding that aggressive bite to maybe an oversaturated sound. If you feel like it's lacking more in those lower mids, that grittier mid-range punch, then lean towards a vintage model and then use that to augment your bass sound. And if you feel like it needs to be a little brighter, a little more scooped, a little fatter, fuller low end, then lean towards a B7K. But, you know, in all instances, you're going to want to dial it in your project and see what it sounds like with your bass DI, because bass DIs have such a wide variance. That's going to sound drastically different from this DI in most cases. So that's pretty much my workflow for getting these set up in a project, and gives you a little contrast between the two different models. Hopefully that helped out, and hopefully you can utilize this information in your own projects.